Good morning and welcome to this new session of our WRI webinar. My name is Luisa Peixoto and I'm an Urban Development Analyst at WRI Brasil. Today, we are going to talk about how to incorporate TOD strategy into a master plan. On this occasion, we have the participation of Henrique Evers, an Urban Development Manager at WRI Brasil. Henrique holds a master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Malaga, Spain, and currently works with WRI Brasil in the Urban and Development and Accessibility team. The main points we are going to deal with will be, first of all, the comprehension of why TOD strategy should be implemented. Second, the use of TOD as a planning strategy. And at last but not least, how TOD should be incorporated in municipal master plans. We also remember you that in the end of the presentation, we will have a questions and answer session.
Hi everyone, this is Henrique, and thank you, Luisa, for the introduction. As Luisa just said, we will talk about how to incorporate TOD in master plans, and almost the entire content of the presentation that we will have today is presented in a publication recently launched by WRI Brasil, which is called TOD in Master Plans. It is available for download only in Portuguese in our website, but since I see that there's a lot of Spanish speakers in the audience, maybe it could be very useful for you to access and download the publication. But the entire content will be presented now in English, and you can have a sense of what we have in this guide. It's a guide focused on technical staff from municipalities, and is very objective on presenting specific actions to incorporate the TOD strategy in the urban planning. So I hope you find this useful for your context and your cities also. Before I start talking about how to incorporate TOD into master plans, we need to start talking about why we talk about TOD and why TOD should be something useful for cities. And the entire background of this discussion of why TOD is the urban form, or the urban patterns and models that cities present when they are developed. So most important is to understand that this form of the cities matters, and matters in terms of efficiency, matters in terms of accessibility, the accessibility to opportunities, to jobs, to houses, to leisure, to education. So the different forms that cities present will have different performance in terms of these indicators. So this is a comparison very well known of two cities, Atlanta and Barcelona, that has the same populations and very different urban forms that impacts on their efficiency and their performance. So here in WRI, we approach these different models and this comparison using a very simple and easy to understand model, the comparison of 3D cities and 3C cities. So the model of a 3D city is the distant, the dispersed and disconnected cities that are monocentric and will present the inefficiency, will have a lot of congestion and impacts that reduces the productivity in terms of the economy of the city. So this is the most common pattern of cities in Brazil and many Latin American cities, and in the urban development, in the developing countries in the world. And what we advocate is to start to act towards changing this urban pattern of 3D cities to what we call 3C cities model. The cities that are compact, connected, and coordinated, and that presents more efficiency, a feasible public transportation systems, and though higher productivity. And we think that the TOD is a strategy to achieve and to help to move and change these patterns of urban development. So the background is we talk about TOD as a way to change the model that cities are developing in the world, in our case in Brazil. So what is it? What is TOD? It's an acronym for Transit Oriented Development. And the explanation of it is, in a very simple way, is the integration of land use and public transportation. So the entire understanding of TOD is to connect land use planning and public transport infrastructure and prioritize investments in development in these portions of the territory of the city where we have public transport infrastructure and provide adequate land use for these areas. But the more broader definition would say that TOD promotes compact urban areas and promotes social interactive, and we will impact on the walkability and the accessibility to jobs, opportunities to leisure, etc., as I said before. So in a nutshell, TOD is about integration, land use, and transportation. It's a strategy to achieve the 3C city model, should be implemented by the public sector, integrated with the private sector, and should be connected to different and sectorial urban agendas in the cities. So TOD is one of the strategies that can be used in cities, but it's not the single one. We can have different strategies for the development of the city, and the TOD will be applied in any specific portion of the city where there is transport infrastructure. So it's not the single solution for the cities. TOD is also defined by some elements, some design aspects that needs to be adopted, integrated in order to achieve the intended objectives of this entire changing towards more sustainable urban development. And this is something new. We are not reinventing the wheel here. The most important thing to understand is that, as you see, there are 7 elements in blue rounding the 8th element that is high quality public transportation. So actually what we are doing here is to present very well-known concepts of sustainable urban design, or the new urbanism, or sustainable urbanism, and applying it connected to high quality public transport. But I will talk about one by one of these elements for you to understand what is each one. But the most important thing here is to understand that we are putting together very good practices and concepts of urban design connected to the public transportation, and this is the idea behind the TOD. But we talk about starting from the top. We talk about the mixed land use, which is a very spread idea to not having monofunctional zoning of the city. So mostly when you are close to the public transportation infrastructure, you need to plan for mixed land uses. Second, you need to prioritize the active transportation modes in order to have more accessibility and better quality of accessibility to the public transportation, but also to provide another means for people to move around these mixed land use areas. And this is very connected to the third one, the urban centralities and ground floor with active uses that will foster the creation of a more livable urban environment with more livability, more vitality, and that also will help the prioritization of the active transportations. Also, the public spaces and green infrastructure are very important to be part of this construction of more sustainable urban environment. Then we have the individual vehicle use management. That is really important when you talk about the TOD, because we are here talking about developing with very good quality areas in the city that are very close to transportation infrastructure. So it's key for the public sector to manage and discourage the use of the individual vehicles, fostering the use of the public transportation and also the active transportation. And also we have the mixed income element that is really important, because as we plan for mixed land use, we need to plan for mixed income and a diversity of profiles of people that can live and work in these areas. So it's important to have this in mind to provide effective actions that will guarantee mixed income uses of these areas of the city. And last, the adequate densities that are usually directly related to TOD. When someone talks about TOD, they start to talk about densities, and it's not just about densifying the areas, but with adequate densities that are determined by the capacity of support of the infrastructures, and not only by the public transportation infrastructure, but also sanitation, electricity, etc. So the densities needs to be adequate to the capacity of support. And also we need to think about different kinds of densities, not just building densities, but populational densities and so on. So those are the elements connected to a high quality public transportation, and this defines what we talk as TOD. So to present to you a bit more of examples and how all these elements comes together in the real world, this is a almost there example, a picture from Joinville in Brazil, where if you look at it, you can see some of these design elements that I just presented. So you have a good public space, residential density, some mix of uses and active ground floor uses. But the thing here is that you have public transport, you have a bus line, but we can't say that this is a TOD implemented because it's not structured by the transportation system and by the transportation infrastructure. So having a bus line crossing the area doesn't mean that this is a TOD project. So it's a very good example of good urbanism. You have some good elements, a lot of things to improve also, but you have some of the elements of TOD, but this is not TOD. This is another good example of how to design a city, but you don't have the infrastructure of transport determining or being a central part of the idea of this development. So other kind of strategy was applied here. Then another example in Brazil, Curitiba, where in this aerial picture you can see the opposite. The infrastructure of transportation is defining and it's being central in the determination of the strategy of land use and the intensity of the land use in the city. So you have a lot of bigger densities along the corridor, but we don't have the picture on the ground, so we can't say if they are using all the other elements of design that we said before. But here is a very good example to see how the transportation infrastructure is being the part that defines and determines the land use planning of the city. And finally, an example where you will have almost everything. So it's a picture from Juiz de Fora in Brazil, and you can see almost all of the elements that we talked before, the mixed use, the residential density, a very good public spaces and green infrastructure, and then you have a bus corridor that is central to this strategy and is structuring the urban development of the city. So this is a very good example where you see all the elements of TOD come together connected to public transportation. And just to finish the definition of TOD, I like to talk a bit about what is not TOD. So don't consider TOD the promotion of density around public transportation, and don't consider TOD a single strategy for financing urban infrastructure. And this is very common when you connect land value capture to TOD and talk as these things being the same things, and they aren't. And it's not the commercial exploitation of a transport hub area. Another very common thing is to say, let's use a bus station as a shopping mall, and this is TOD. So no, this is not TOD if you do it separately. But all of these things that I just said, the promotion of density, a strategy for financing, and the commercial exploitation of a transport hub area can be TOD if they are implemented together and if they use the other elements that I just explained to you. Okay, now that we understand a bit more our approach here in WRI Brasil to TOD and what is it, how can we turn this strategy into a reality? So how can we start to do this going from the theoretical way to implementation? And then I want to share that personal experience that I started working here in WRI Brazil in TOD projects, not on planning, but in projects implementation. And at that time, 3 or 4 years ago, the design and all these concepts that I just said about mixed land use and densities and active transportation, etc. This was very well known already, and there were a consensus about it. So we started to not talking about the design, but we start thinking about how to implement. And when we talked about how to implement TOD projects, we discussed how to finance it, so the strategies for financing, the land value capture mechanisms, etc., and the governance aspects, the institutional arrangements necessary to put these kind of integrated projects, to put all together and make it happen. But at some point, we found out that all of this discussion is very important, but it's almost impossible to move forward any TOD project that combines land use planning and investments in infrastructure, mainly in public transport, without talking about the legislation, the urban codes, the urban planning, and the laws that define the way that the land is used and the buildings are built, etc. So we found that the legislation and the master plannings are key to any kind of TOD project, and we need to talk very focused on this kind of thing. And also, there's a huge opportunity here in Brazil where many cities are starting to review their master plans right now. They are in a cycle of 10 years, so it's a huge opportunity to have new master plans that include TOD as a strategy and prepares the floor for future TOD projects to come. And that's why we talk about how to incorporate TOD into master plans. I want to explain you a bit how the municipal master plans work, at least here in Brazil, and the roles that they have. Here we have the city statute, federal law that obliges many municipalities to have their municipal master plans. And the municipal master plans here in Brazil, they are approved as a law, they are enacted as a law, and defines almost everything that is formally built in the city. So they are very important, and they are very efficient, at least in a way that they drive and they define things that are being built in the city. But there's a huge gap yet in the way that we do the master plans here in Brazil, because the master plans have two different roles. They can have this strategic role where you establish the vision of the future of the city, what kind of urban development you want for your city, and that's where the TOD strategy can come. and then you can say that the transportation infrastructure will be the structure of the form of the city, for instance. So there's a very strategic role where you define a strategic planning for the city, but also you have a normative role where you define all the criteria, the codes, the zoning, the densities, etc. Then we have here in Brazil many master plans that are just strategic, where you define the strategy and say what you want for the future, but you don't define you define nothing about normative and how to implement this strategy. And sometimes you have the opposite, master plans that define a lot of codes and rules, but they are not connected to a strategic vision. So using TOD, we are also trying to fill this gap and make more effective the way we think strategically about the urban development and put these in master plans as a normative role and make it happen efficiently using some urban codes that will make the strategy happen. So that's the entire discussion on how to use master plans to promote TOD. And this is a very good example on the influence that the master plans have in the way that city is built. On the top, you have a picture that shows urban vitality, and this is defined by the master plan because you can promote the picture of the top, and then if you see the picture below, where you have a lot of walls and a very dead street, this can be regulated by master plans. For example, determining that some kind of developments can't have walls. This is a very simple example on how master plans influence the way that our cities are built. Then, how we can incorporate TOD in master plans? How can we use master plans as effective tools to implement TOD? And to do so, we think about some steps. First, this strategic role is where the master plan defines the TOD corridor. So you will look at the city scale, and we will look to the entire city to define some strategies, and one of these strategies will be TOD and the corridors. Then you go a little bit down in the scale and see that what kind of guidelines for TOD you can have for the transport corridors, and then you start to work on the normative, on the codes. And this is to have another model of city, the 3C city. So these two steps before are the strategic and normative. We have specific actions for each one of them, and I will present each one of them for you. First, we have 3 territorial principles for urban development that are the compact, connected, and coordinated, and you will see it when you think about city scale. And then we have 8 actions for corridors or stations at the corridor level. So starting by the first principle, the compact urban growth. Oh, this is something that you need to look at the entire city and talks about controlling the urban sprawl and guarantee the smart growth. So this is when you will have to look at the perimeter, the definition of the perimeter of the city, and the planning of expansion areas for the city. So here we are just saying in the publication how you can plan for smart growth and how you can control the expansion of the city and promote the occupation of urban voids and controlling urban sprawl, etc. The second principle is the connected infrastructure, and this is where TOD happens. When you connected your territorial strategy to the presence of infrastructure. So here's where you define the TOD corridors and you do the zoning and you define different land uses based on the capacity of support of the infrastructure or the future capacity of support for the infrastructure. So here you will use the zoning as the main tool and optimize the use of infrastructure in the city. So this is the principle 2, connected infrastructure. And then we have the coordinated management. And here we decided to be very specific about the land market and the land values management. So the third principle, the coordination, is based on the management of the land values in order to can be able to use land value capture mechanisms as financing strategy of the city. And the master plan is key. It's a key step to unlock the land value capture mechanism. So what we say here is that the master plans needs to include legal instruments that promote densification at the same time that allows for land value capture, making it possible to invest in city. And I will try to explain very quickly something that we advocate here in Brazil to include in the master plans as a very important step to implement land value capture and therefore TOD in the future, to invest in TOD. So this is the differentiation of basic floor area ratio, the basic FAR, and the variation of maximum FAR along the urban territory. So you need to include this differentiation of basic and maximum FARs, and then you can define a land value capture instrument that will charge for the additional FAR that someone needs to buy in order to build a bit more. And then you use this money to distribute investments in the territory and make another parts of the city capable of receive more densification. But the main idea here is to differentiate the basic floor area ratio from the maximum, and I can explain a bit further this during the questions and answers. Well, these were the three principles, and then we can go deep and talk about the corridor level and the 8 actions to implement TOD at the corridor level. But first, we need to define what extent we have for the corridor level. So we just define here very briefly that something between 500 meters and 1,000 meters should be an ideal distance from the transportation infrastructure to implement these strategies at the corridor level. And then we have these 8 actions at the TOD corridor level. Once you have defined by the principles some TOD corridors to apply this strategy. And the 8 actions that we present, they intend by the codes on the master planning, on the master plans, define ways to implement the design elements from TOD. So each action will be related to some of the TOD elements that we presented before. So the first action 1, it's intensify densification and land use around public transport and corridor. This is about densities and mixed land use, and it's the core of the TOD strategy is to intensify the land use where there's infrastructure for public transport. And how the master plans should do this? They should give priority to new developments, to projects in the areas where the public transportation infrastructure is. So we can promote more densification. We can have, you probably need to have higher FARs in these areas, and you can apply some instruments to encourage mixed uses, also different housing patterns in these areas. And then in the publication, we present very specific instruments from the Brazilian law, from the city statute, where you can use to promote it. Here we are doing an adaptation and making more generic to have a relation with the general context of different cities in the world. The second action is to discourage underutilized land in areas served by high quality public transport. So this is related to mixed income and again the densities. It's about promoting the development of vacant areas, and you can do it using property taxes, compulsory construction, and it's very important important to articulate this fostering of the use of some vacant land to housing strategies. So the master plans can propose instruments to stimulate or compel the implementation of new development in these areas, and they can avoid real estate speculation in these areas and can articulate housing investments with these areas. Sometimes penalizing the maintenance of empty buildings or determining compulsory use of some vacant areas. In other moments, you can do some real estate consortiums or other arrangements to foster the use of these underutilized areas. The third action is about the mixed income. It's to diversify housing patterns. So it's to promote housing, which is mixed land use, and with different patterns, which is mixed income. And the master plans should do this, defining areas for social housing. In Brazil, we have a very specific instrument where you determine a social housing special interest area. And you need to, in the master plans, intensify the use of these kind of instruments closer to the public transportation. We can also promote the implementation of a ratio for social housing in greater investments or in greater developments. The fourth action is the integration of private and public spaces in favor of pedestrians. So this is about incentivizing new buildings, incentivize that they have active uses on the ground floor. You can promote more semi-public areas and larger sidewalks by including incentives in the master plans. So you can promote incentives to the buildings to have active uses in the ground floor. Maybe you can do incentives based on the FAR. For instance, you can give more FAR if the project has active uses in the ground floor. We can use another transfer of building rights instruments to have more space for sidewalks or for semi-public areas. So you can use the master plans to promote this integration between private and public spaces and making the built environment more friendly for the pedestrians. The fifth action is to promote good quality public spaces in strategic green areas. It's very related to the other one when you prioritize the active modes of transportation, but mainly connected to public spaces and green infrastructure. So what master plans can do about it is to reserve land along the transport corridor to provide infrastructure to pedestrians, and this means sidewalks, but means reserving land for new public spaces, for parks and other green areas, and it can be connected to other sectorial agendas like urban vegetation and urban trees in the city. The sixth action is to discourage the use of private vehicle along public transportation. It's something that I said before, when it's very important to do vehicle use management inside the TOD corridors and discourage the use. And mainly what can master plans can do about it is to determine maximum number of parking spots by number of residences in the area of influence of the corridor. So you can do a very effective management of the parking spots by the urban codes defined in the master plans. The seventh action is to articulate and connect this social infrastructure to public transport network. So again, mixed income and mixed land use. It's about pre-selecting areas to implement social infrastructure and public facilities. So mainly what master plans can do about it is to include rules that will guarantee the implementation of some public facilities closer to the transportation. You can, again, reserve specific lands for investments in schools or hospitals or social assistance, and you can connect these directly to the transportation infrastructure, and you can promote new and better public spaces, also combining and make a urban planning that combines these different kinds of public facilities closer to the transportation infrastructure, which will be more accessible to everyone once you have high quality public transport that connects different parts of the city to this corridor. And the last one, the 8th action, is about encouraging the implementation of cycling infrastructure. So how you can promote more active transportation, mainly cycling infrastructure, and manage and discourage the use of individual vehicle. So again, you can work mainly on the parking management that relates to master plans. So master plans can request parking and support areas for cyclists as basic components to approve new buildings. So you can request changing rooms or minimum parking places for bikes as codes for the approval of new buildings. So these were the 8 actions and the entire framework of 3 territorial principles for urban development and 8 actions for the corridor. These, I believe, are very effective ways to incorporate the TOD strategy in the master plans in a way that will be implemented along the years after the definition of the master plan. So just to summarize what we talked since the beginning of this presentation, we started talking about the entire idea of the sustainability, economical, social, and environmental, and this means a more sustainable model of city and a model of urban development, the 3C city. And to achieve it, we talk about TOD as a strategy in the urban planning to change this current pattern of cities. And we saw that to implement TOD is not, we can't talk about only projects on design, governance, and finance, but that the legislation is really crucial to its implementation. And then you have a very important role of the municipal master plans as the main tool to change the urban codes and legislation for implementation of TOD. And then we have our assessment on actions and principles and how to incorporate it into municipal master plans. So thank you very much for watching this, and now let's open a bit for questions, and I hope I can answer all of your doubts right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for the presentation. And right now, we are going to read some of your questions. The first one was made by Mr. Covaleda. He would like to know if it's necessary or a good idea to include land value capture schemes in a brownfield project. Particularly think that charging current residents for basic infrastructure, and if this could be and could lead to unnecessary displacement.
Well, this is a very important question, and as I said, land value capture is very used for TOD projects, and the master plans are very important to define the legal framework of its implementation. So if you think that the investment in public infrastructure, such as a bus corridor, will raise the land values, the idea is that the public sector should capture some of these increment on the land values. And for sure, land value capture should be used to finance TOD projects. The thing about displacement and the unfairness of implementing these is that you need to think that mainly this will be applied in the land values and in new developments that will be done inside this area. So that's why we bring the third action, the diversification of housing patterns, is really important to mitigate at least some of these displacements by thinking upfront how we can provide different patterns of housing and some patterns of housing or that won't be influenced by this raising on the land value. So we can promote, we can capture some land values from the more market-oriented housing developments, but you can also provide some alternative developments of housing that won't be affected by the charge of the land value capture mechanisms.
Thank you, Henrique. Right now we have two questions that can have similar answers. So one is a question from Mr. Hernandez, and the other one is from Mr. Ramirez. The first one asks about how we should propose a mixed use in a block in downtown and what kind of uses. And the other one asks more specifically about how we should improve urban vitality. If this is only a consequence or if we can really promote this kind of vitality in urban areas.
Well, I think I can answer both questions by reinforcing the difference of TOD as a strategy in the urban planning and TOD as projects, urban projects that will be implemented more structurally. So as I presented, urban vitality or mixed land use can be promoted by the master plans, incorporating some instruments, some tools. So you can do zoning for mixed land use, you can do some conditionalities for building approvals that will promote mixed buildings or mixed uses in the blocks. And then therefore the urban vitality by the active uses of the ground floors or more larger sidewalks, etc. So the master plan can create the right conditions for these things to happen, but the master plan by itself won't be implementing anything. So there's a second step before having good master plans, that is things fostered by the public sector, but can be integrated projects, but it needs to be done. Projects needs to be done after the master plans to do actually the implementation of this more sustainable type of urban development. So it's really important to understand that the master plans are the first step, and it's a very important way to prepare the ground for future projects to come. And it also is important to say that in our publication, in the guide, the last chapter of the publication is about this final step when you move from plan to project. And there we talk a bit more how to structure TOD projects, and this involves the governance and financing mechanisms that I showed you before.
And complementing this question from Mr. Hernandez, he also asks about historical and protected zones, how we can implement these mixed use areas.
Okay, this is a tricky question. I showed the 8 elements, the mixed use, the densities, the active transportation, the management of vehicle use, green spaces, etc. And we also bring in the publication two complementary elements that defines TOD, and they are one of them is the preservation of identity and cultural heritage. So it's really important to connect the TOD strategy to the cultural context of the territories that you are applying this strategy. It's really important to balance it in order to prevent developments that will be very impactful in the areas. So we have a very interesting example here in Brazil of a project that is in the project is impacting the cultural identity, but the project is also using a lot of investments to protect the cultural heritage. This is the Porto Maravilha project in Rio de Janeiro. It's an urban operation, and at the same time, it's very intrusive, and they are changing a lot the skyline of this area. They are also investing a lot of money on preserving some of the historical heritage there. There's also the third part of this discussion, which is the local communities that are not receiving that lot of money, which impacts also the cultural heritage. So it's not only about buildings, but it's also about people and who are living there. So also the cultural heritage is connected to the mixed income element and how you can diversify the patterns of housing and how you can protect the existing communities and the existing culture and identity in this area. So it's really hard to manage it, such as the displacement thing is very hard to manage, but you can mitigate if you have it as one of your elements that defines your TOD strategy.
Thank you, Henrique. Another question from Mr. Covaleda is how to ensure that the real estate market plays along with the transportation investments, and are land use and transport models worth the effort? What kind of cooperation with the private sector is possible to ensure the development as planned?
I think part of the answer comes from the principles discussion, the three principles. So to connect the efforts and the investments of the city to bring them to the transit corridors, it won't happen only because you built the transportation infrastructure. It's not enough to attract the real estate market. So you need to manage the entire city distribution of FARs, of incentives, and types of land uses, the zoning. You need to manage the entire city to make the corridors more attractive and make it a priority for your urban development efforts. Only then you have the private investments coming to the areas of TOD. So it's not just about investing in the infrastructure, but also creating the environment. So this is really important. And that's why we talk about the principles, and you talk about the coordination of the land values and the definition of the perimeter. For instance, you can't give because in the end you are given different kinds of incentives and restrictions. So for example, if you define a very large urban perimeter, so you are providing a lot of land to the real estate market to urbanize. So how can you attract the real estate to the corridors if there's a lot of land available and cheaper to be urbanized? So you need to work with a balance of restricting the horizontal growth and bringing the investments to the vacant land or to the land connected to the transportation infrastructure.
Thank you. And another question is about TOD strategy in Latin America, if it's following a social vision or if it's exclusively market-driven. What tools are recommended to avoid massive displacement of residents due to increased accessibility?
Yeah, as I said, when I explained what is not TOD, this is exactly what I was trying to differentiate. So many times TOD is seen as a market-driven strategy, as something where you will foster the economic development by moving forward the real estate market and the developers, etc. And what we advocate here is to have not only the social view and the accessibility, but a more broad territorial vision of the city. So it's first of all it's part of the entire strategy of the city and the vision of the future of the city. So what kind of urban development you want for your city in the future, you will use TOD as a strategy to achieve it, and this is connected to different objectives: the social objective, the economic development objective, the environmental protection objective, the cultural heritage protection objective, etc. So it needs to be connected to this entire strategy of the city. Uh, and again, about the displacement, uh, it's it's almost intrinsic to this kind of massive investments in infrastructure and having massive investments from the private sector in the real estate market also. It's almost intrinsic that you will have pressure for displacement and the gentrification processes. So what we bring here is the social lens, bringing together different tools that you can use to mitigate this kind of impact. But it's almost impossible not to have these impacts, but you can use a lot of instruments to mitigate it. So you can define upfront these social housing special areas of interest. You can define some conditions for approval of the buildings that we will make more diverse patterns of housing. You can use some of these tools. You can define the vacant land to be only used for housing and specific types of housing, so you can reserve some areas in the corridor to be used to mitigate these impacts of gentrification.
Thank you, Henrique. We have a last question for Mr. Covaleda. It's about assuming a sectorial planning institutional structure, how to ensure transportation and land, urban land, development would go along the same lines. Is a regional master plan enough? Is it necessary to implement an upper authority to organize this development?
Okay, two things about it. Uh, First, we can answer this by talking about the fifth chapter of our publication, where we show some premises or some conditions that are very important in order to move forward TOD projects. So yes, one of the things is about having not an upper authority, but at least an integrated authority that maybe a public company or maybe an integrating agency that has this authority to manage integrated projects and have some kind of influence on the land use, but at the same time they can manage the public transportation. So this is one of the key aspects that we present in this fifth chapter about projects, TOD projects and implementation. Also, the second way to answer this question is about the regional planning, and I tried to show you the effectiveness of master plans here in Brazil at the municipal level. So they are very effective because you have this law, this tool that make it very influential in the way that the cities are built. But I know this is not a reality in all of the countries. Anyway, even here in Brazil, we have the municipal master plans, but in many cities we have a metropolitan context, and many times the municipal master plans are not connected together in the different cities of a metropolitan region. So this approach that we present, where you, with the 3 principles, when you need to, for instance, manage the land values in the entire area of the city, this is very important. But if you have neighbor cities that are not doing the same kind of land values management, probably you can create some market distortions between cities, and sometimes the real estate market can be attracted to cities that are more free or less regulated than in your city. So it's really important to articulate the regional planning and integrate also the different municipal master plans within a metropolitan area. So this is really important, and it's something that we are not talking about here yet.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for your presentation and answering all the questions. Our session is coming to an end. We also would like to invite you to our next webinar of benchmarking for high-quality bus public transport on September 6th at 10 a.m. Mexico City time. And we also would like to remember you that this presentation will be available also on the CityFix Learn. Thank you very much for joining us today for this session. If you are interested in our programming, you can find it at www.thecityfixlearn.org. Follow us also on our social networks, Facebook and Twitter, as WRI Cidades. You can see both links on the bottom of the screen. Hope to see you next time. Bye. Thank you.